Great. It looks like we have a really good audience joining us here today. So I'm delighted that so many people have joined the event, and we see plenty of familiar faces here with us as well. So that's fantastic. I'll just repeat my introduction for anyone who wasn't in. I'm Ciara O'Flynn, Consul General of Ireland here in Atlanta. I want to welcome you to our event today. And we are really delighted to be able to bring it to you. And we're delighted to welcome Damian Shiels, our guest speaker and our guest star, and also delighted to support the Andersonville Irish Project and to share it with you. As I said, we're going to hear from Damian shortly. But first of all, I'm going to give a very brief introduction to the project and just talk about its significance and the Consulate's involvement in it. So as many people know, and as Damian's going to tell us in much more detail, Andersonville in Georgia, which was also known as Camp Sumter, was the largest military prison operated during the US Civil War. And it was run by Confederate forces with over 40,000 Union soldiers held there. The whole point of the Andersonville Irish Project is to commemorate the Irish experience at Andersonville. And it appears from the ongoing research that Damian is leading with others that more Irish people who served in the US Civil War are interred here in Andersonville than in any other national cemetery in the US. As I mentioned, our guest speaker, our guest star, and the lead on the project is Damian Shiels, a historian and really an expert in this area. And he's working closely with Nicholas Allen, the director of the Wilson Center for Humanities at the University of Georgia. And support is coming from the Consulate, of course, here in Atlanta, the Department of Foreign Affairs, the US National Park Service, and others. I really want to emphasize that it's a long-term project and partnership. The project already involves research, social media, and hopefully will involve a lot more virtual events like this one, and also an in-person commemorative event at Andersonville itself that hopefully will come together, conditions allowing, within the next year. I just want to touch a little bit on why this work and this project is important and why we're so happy to support it from the Irish Consulate and the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs. I think it's really a crucial piece of work in recording and remembering the contributions made by the Irish diaspora here in the US. The project brings up a lot of questions around the identity and the history of Irish Americans. As I mentioned, most of the prisoners at Andersonville, and therefore most of the Irish and Irish Americans interred there, were Union soldiers. The camp was run by Confederate forces. So I think it really brings up a lot of interesting questions around Irish American identity, and especially here in the US South. Another really important point to emphasize is that the Irish soldiers came from all over the island of Ireland, from different backgrounds and faiths, and that is extremely relevant in today's context. One of the key priorities of the Irish government at the moment is a commitment to a shared island on the island of Ireland. And that includes working with all communities and traditions on the island to build consensus around a shared future, underpinned, of course, by the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that work like this, the work that Damian and colleagues are doing, can be of huge service to those goals. So now turning to Damian to give him an introduction before he gets going with his presentation. Damian Shiels is an archaeologist, a historian, a curator, an author, and a leading expert on the Irish diaspora in the US, and particularly the Irish in the American Civil War. He holds a PhD in history from Northumbria University, where his research focused on the correspondence of Irish Americans in Union service. And he also has huge experience and expertise as a conflict archaeologist and an exhibition curator. He's a significant published author. He has several books to his name and numerous articles and contributions. And I told Damian just before the event that attempting to summarize or list or even keep track of all of his work was impossible. So I would just try and leave it at that. But needless to say, he is very much an expert in the field. He's also led lecturing tours in Ireland, the UK, and across the US on the US Civil War and the Irish contribution to it. Damian founded the website Irish in the American Civil War, which has led to the Andersonville Irish Project. and we are just delighted and thrilled and honored to work with him. One final thing on a personal note, what I really admire about Damian and his work is the way that he brings history to life. He focuses a lot on the personal histories of the Irish in America, including on this Andersonville Irish Project. And I think that's particularly effective in uncovering the research, bringing it to life, and making it relevant to today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Damian, and after his presentation, we'll have time for Q&A. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Damian and to the discussion afterwards. Thank you. Over to you, Damian.
Thanks so much, Ciara, and thanks a very humbling introduction. I hope I can live up to it over the next 30 minutes or so. Just to say, I mean, it's absolutely fantastic to be working with the Consulate and the department and with Nicholas and the University of Georgia and the National Parks, everybody who's contributing towards this. I think it shows the degree to which what occurred at Andersonville and kind of what the stories that are associated with all of these people who never came home from there, how they can resonate. And as you say, it's an all-Ireland story. It impacted everybody, no matter where they were on the island, and indeed in the Irish American communities across much of the world. Hopefully you can now see my screen. Just to give you, this is pretty much an introduction to the, has that come up as the first slideshow, or is it still shown as a presentation, just as a matter of interest? Hopefully you should have the initial slides there. In any event, it's not a disaster if it doesn't roll on exactly as planned. But in any event, just to give you a bit of a brief overview, I'm going to be, it's very much a kind of an introductory talk on the Andersonville Irish Project. So I want to give you a bit of a background on the scale of Irish service in the Union military, and then move on to just touch on some of the stuff that Ciara was mentioning as well about Andersonville itself, and then some of the things that we're looking to find out about the project. And then I'm going to kind of spend the second half just looking at a few of those personal stories and a few of the different elements that what examining men who died in this cemetery can tell us, not only about Irish service in the war, not only about how those men interacted with each other in the war, but about things like Irish immigration and about the women, the Irish women in the mid-19th century, about the impact of the American Civil War on people in Ireland, for example. Okay, so that's some of the areas that I'm hoping to cover. So if I just move on to the first slide here. The American Civil War is a colossal event in Irish history because of the scale of Irish immigration. A lot of it occurred, and the most famous element of it occurred after the famine, but there had been significant Irish immigration prior to the famine. And so much so that by the time the American Civil War breaks out, there are 1.6 million people who've been born on the island of Ireland living in the United States of America. It's an absolutely colossal number of individuals. If you were walking down the streets in New York City, particularly in Manhattan, and if you were in Manhattan, way over 1 in 4 of the people that you would have encountered walking around those streets was born in the island of Ireland. Right? So it's an absolutely colossal Irish center in New York City. And New York City dominates the Irish story of the United States during the American Civil War in this period. The scale of Irish born people in the United States meant that when the war came, in and around 180,000 Irish born men enlist in the or serve in the Union forces, either as volunteers or they were in the United States Regular Army. To give you an impression of the Irish dominance of the US Regular Army, when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter to begin the war in 1861, there were more Irish born than American born soldiers inside the fort. So the Irish dominated the regulars, and they enlisted the volunteers in huge numbers. So the Irish story of the war often gets diluted down to just those people who were born in Ireland. But as many of you, I'm sure, are aware today, in the 19th century, there were ethnic groupings of people who often stuck together even if they were born in different locales. And the Irish had suffered from significant nativism, as it was called, during the 1850s. They had had to endure the Know Nothing Party, which had risen to prominence in the 1850s and wasn't a big fan of the Irish immigrants during that period. And so what you get is an awful lot of cohesiveness in Irish ethnic community groups. Coupled with that, the Irish tended to do what was called step migration, where they would often go to another country and spend a number of years there before moving on to the United States. And the result of that is that large numbers of Scottish-born, English-born, Welsh-born, and Canadian-born people who served in the American Civil War were actually ethnically Irish and saw themselves as ethnically Irish. So when you include them and all of the American-born children of Irish immigrants into the mix, that's an additional 70,000 men who were serving in the Union military who were ethnically Irish, which adds up to a total of in and around 250,000 men. So 250,000 men in United States uniform are ethnically Irish. Just a couple of other kind of facts and figures. The Medal of Honor, the highest award for gallantry during the Civil War. At least 146 Irish-born men received that award for actions during the American Civil War in United States service. In the Union Navy, 20% of that force had been born on the island of Ireland. Again, that's not to include those who were ethnically Irish, just those born in Ireland. Massive proportion, probably Ireland's biggest ever contribution to a naval force in conflict. We'll never know because of the way the records are kept and because it's often difficult to identify, one of the reasons we're trying to do this project, where men were from and their ethnicity. But based on the figures that we can kind of suggest for the likelihood of death in the United States service, the likelihood of death in Confederate service, in and around on both sides, around 25 to 35,000 Irish-born men died in the American Civil War. And what's often overlooked is the fact that it is, in modern Irish history, the biggest conflict. And this includes the First World War, in fact, the biggest conflict for many Irish counties. So for most of the province of Munster, which saw massive immigration, for much of the west coast of Ireland, which saw mass immigration, for parts of northwest Ulster, which saw mass immigration, the American Civil War is the war that saw more men in uniform and more men dying in uniform than any other in the modern history of Ireland. So it's a very significant conflict. And one of the things it gives us as a result of this is the records that were generated by this military experience give us a window not only into the soldiers themselves, but the lives of their families that surrounded them and part of their immigrant story. Okay, so just have a look at the next slide. These are figures, and I'm not going to go into them in any great detail, but this is just giving you an idea of Irish volunteers. So these aren't guys who are serving in the permanent professional military. These are people who volunteered into the volunteer regiments in the United States service during the war. And the figures to highlight for you here are the ones here, the number of Irish volunteers out in New York, well in excess of 50,000 Irish-born men, this is just Irish-born men, enlist in the volunteer service out in New York State. And you can see that 13% of the population of the state was Irish-born at that time, but they make up over 15% of the volunteers. And this is generally repeated across much of the North. So the Irish serve at or above, in many instances, their percentage of the population, which is a very interesting element when you consider that they had significant problems in terms of being accepted and being integrated in the 1850s, that the conditions that the war creates nonetheless see them serve at or above their proportion of the United States population. All right, so that's just a bit of a background on the numbers who are serving, and there's a very big number of Irish Americans who would have been entering the war in 1863 and 1864 as well, a lot of them for financial reasons. And so they make up a big proportion of the US forces as 1864 dawns. And the parole system in the American Civil War, which had seen prisoners being exchanged, had by that stage broken down. There was no longer exchanges taking place, and these prisons were becoming larger and larger and needed to look after more and more men. So Andersonville itself, what's often staggering to consider in relation to Andersonville is how brief it was in terms of how long it was open. Just 14 months from February 1864. So the first prisoners that enter Andersonville come there in February 1864. Many of them had been prisoners for quite a length of time. There are Irish Americans who die in Andersonville who've been captured in places like Gettysburg the previous July of 1863 and had been kept around Richmond. But February 1864 is when it opens in Georgia and takes in its first prisoners. And it is an open compound. This illustration is one of the most famous illustrations of it. It was drawn by an Irishman, Thomas O'Dea, who served in the 16th Maine Infantry and survived his incarceration in Andersonville. But it was a simple stockade, 15-foot high stockade that enclosed 16.5 acres of land. During June, as the prison population soared, this is when more and more prisoners were being taken in by the Confederates as the major campaigns by Ulysses S. Grant and by Sherman have kicked off. It is extended to 26.5 acres in size. And indeed, there's only a handful of months really where Andersonville is the prison that we kind of all know and think of it, this overcrowded prison. And it's in the late summer that it's reaching this really terrible scale of men who are in there, and the deaths are going through the roof. So it reaches 33,000 men in August 1864, more than 3 times its intended capacity. And there's 100 men dying a day in and around that on average in that month in Andersonville. So somewhere in the region of 45,000 US soldiers passed through the prison during its lifetime, and of them almost 13,000 died. Okay, and we're indebted to Dorrance Atwater, was one of the prisoners there, and it was his job to record the names of those who died as they died, and he took a copy of that list, and he and Clara Barton, who tends not to need much introduction, the most famous nurse of the American Civil War, journey back to Andersonville shortly after the war and begin the process of naming, putting names to the numbers that were on the graves in Andersonville. And as a result, the vast majority of those men who died at Andersonville are named. There's only a few hundred of them who aren't. Okay, so that's the kind of starting point. But these figures, this scale of death is on a degree that absolutely dwarfs anything else in the war. So you might think that Gettysburg might be comparable, that Chickamauga might be comparable. They are not. Andersonville far outstrips them, and that's why it is the likely place where more Irish Americans are interred as a result of the Civil War than any other. So the project itself then, Ciara went through the aims really beforehand, but we know that there have to be hundreds of Irish Americans, and it is almost certain, in fact I would say certain without a doubt, that there are thousands of Irish Americans among that almost 13,000, and that the Irish proportion of that is running into the thousands. So we're keen to identify those Irish Americans who died in the prison, and we're doing that through a combination of crowdsourcing, so asking people to submit individuals that they know to be Irish American, so born in Ireland or whose parents were born in Ireland, and we're also conducting our own research. And there's 2 aims behind that. We want to create a database that's available to everyone, that they can look at the individuals who are Irish American who were interred there, and we also want to tie them back to the island of Ireland. And if you go onto the project page, which is I'll have the link at the end of it, you can view the database, and you can also view this interactive map, which is where we currently sit in relation to those locales on the island that have somebody who is interred in Andersonville Cemetery associated with them. And you can see the spread of it, a pretty even spread throughout the island. Once you get these men's identity, they act as a research pool, as a study group. And so they can tell us things about what Irish American service was like and the Irish American experience at Andersonville. And I'm going to touch on that momentarily. It allows us to look at their families, because a lot of those who die during the war, their families become entitled to dependent pensions, widows' pensions, mothers' pensions. And so you can explore some of their lives and their subsequent experience to see what the impact of Andersonville had on them, but also discover things about chain migration, about step migration, about how people lived before the war, about the communities that they lived in and the networks that they formed. It serves, and through the partnerships that we have with the Consulate and events like this, to increase awareness of the impact of Andersonville, the impact of the American Civil War on Irish Americans and their communities. And as Ciara was mentioning, it allows us to explore with the National Park Service appropriate avenues for remembering the loss of these individuals and the impact it had close to the National Historic Site itself. So the story so far then, we've gone through, we're a bit above this now, but we're in and around the 360, 370 mark. We've identified officially on the database as it's currently uploaded 350 Irish American men. And just to kind of give you a very quick run through of some of the kind of high level facts and figures about these 350 men. We have identified one from at least every county of the 32 counties on the island of Ireland. So some of these men are pinned to counties, some of them are pinned to parishes, as we'll see, some of them are pinned to buildings. 21 of them are linked with County Cork, and that is something that we would expect to be the case. County Cork has the highest degree of emigration. It had the highest population in the mid-19th century. It has the highest emigration in this period, and they tend to serve in the highest numbers in the American Civil War. So we would expect that to more or less remain the county that has the most representation at Andersonville. Currently, and these are all obviously subject to change, it's got Cavan, Donegal, Kerry and Limerick are the next counties in terms of representation that are identified. We've done pretty well in identifying men to county. Lots of men in the American Civil War who were born in Ireland are recorded as being born in the United States. Lots of men who are born in Ireland give no further information to tell us where their county is. So it can be very difficult to discern where men are from. But fortunately, of those we found so far, 42% have been identified at least to county of origin. Okay, so that's pretty positive in where we're standing so far. I mentioned at the outset that Irish Americans are not just people born in Ireland. So the vast bulk of those that we've identified have been born in Ireland because that is the easiest way to link their ethnicity. But there are a number of them, and we'll be looking at a couple of them momentarily, who are born elsewhere. So we have men born in the United States, England, Scotland, and Canada, the four main diaspora Ireland countries that contribute towards Irish Americans in the war. There are men born into Irish communities in all four of those countries who are interred there that have been identified. And we'll be looking at two England lads straight off the bat who are Irish, but would tend to be classified as English incorrectly if you were just to look at their nativity. And unsurprisingly, given that we know August was the deadliest month at Andersonville, August is so far the deadliest month among the men that we've gathered together, the 350. And the 10th of August currently stands as the single worst day, if you like, of the conflict. What about units then? And I would have to give a severe warning with this in that the initial research, we're getting all the time when we get contributions in, it can be various different states. But the research is currently focused on the state of New York. So, but New York will obviously be dominant, but we're concentrating on New York at the moment. And it won't surprise you to see that the 69th New York Infantry, the most famous volunteer Irish infantry unit of the American Civil War, is currently at the top of the representative pool with 14. Along with the 2nd Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, which was not an ethnic Irish unit, but was filled with Irish Americans. And that's something you see consistently. I should add that there are lots more men in these units who are obviously Irish American who died here, but where we can't definitively show it initially, we're not including them at this stage in the project. But we're just including those who we can definitively state at the moment. Plenty of other units have very high representation. The 99th New York Infantry, again, not an ethnic Irish unit officially, absolutely filled with Irish Americans, many of whom died in Andersonville. The 164th New York Infantry, which was Irish ethnic unit, Corcoran's Irish Legion, and the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry, which had a very strong Irish identity out of Philadelphia, also there. But 137 different units so far have had Irish Americans in Andersonville National Cemetery. So you can see, and that's one of the things that's particularly notable about Irish service in the United States military during the war is it's spread. It's spread across multiple units, spread across a lot of states, dominated by New York, dominated by Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Illinois to a lesser degree, but is spread across units and across states. So there are men everywhere that are involved in this. I will have to try and get the next slide to work properly, given as so I might stop share and reshare again just on here. So if you can just bear with me, because it's got animations going on it. So I will. Sorry, one moment. This is our technical glitch of the day. Okay, so I think are you seeing my full screen now?
We are, yeah, we've got the full screen, Damian.
So yeah, so this one, I just want to go through a few of the personal stories in relation to these men. So the first things that we can kind of discern out of it are what type of men are interred here and what the relationships might have been. So if we look at these four men, and these are all of the images you see that are cemetery images are Andersonville National Cemetery men interred in them. You'll notice from these four that these four men have the same names: 2 McCabe's on the top, 2 Dunns on the bottom. The men on the top are Patrick and John McCabe, who both served in the 12th New York Cavalry. They both served in Company F. They were both captured at Plymouth. Almost certainly both of them are from County Longford. And everything points to the fact that these 2 men are brothers who die in Andersonville. Patrick, this hasn't been 100% confirmed, but everything points to the fact that they are, including their likely census return from 1860. And immediately that makes us think about what was that like, and what's it like to watch your brother die in Andersonville. And then of course the ultimate sadness that the brother dies as well, the second brother, and what it does to the family back home. Patrick McCabe on the top right there died on the 26th of June 1864, followed on the 12th of July by John. All right, so a lot of this isn't very happy stuff, which is often the case when you're looking at these sort of stories. The 2 men on the bottom are absolutely, definitely brothers. There's no doubt about it. They both served in the 99th New York Infantry, Company I. And their parents, they're Michael and James Dunn. They were both born in England as part of the Irish diaspora. Their parents were married in Kilmacteague in County Sligo in 1830. Before they went to England, where both the Dunns were born, almost certainly in the north of England, among the Irish community there. And then they move on to the United States. And James is the first to die on the 7th of June, and Michael lasts somewhat of a month later, dying on the 12th of July, 1864. And both now resting together in the Sligo diaspora, men resting together in Andersonville National Cemetery. So that's kind of some of the most visceral types of links that we have. But one of the things that particularly interests me in this is how do Irish Americans interact with each other in these camps? And as well as looking at just things like pension files and stuff, we're trying to build a bigger picture of how men react. And there has been work done by Civil War historians that's shown from a statistical basis that Irish Americans, if they went in the same company, seem to have banded together and seem to have had a better chance of survival as a result of that within specific companies, that they're cohesive. My own work on the Irish and the United States military shows that they tend to be cohesive as well. But this is a particularly interesting example that I'm showing you here because this shows interesting cohesion across units because of their county of origin. And the man at the top here is called Michael Doherty. He's from Falcarra in County Donegal. And he served out of Pennsylvania in the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry that we were mentioning briefly earlier. Michael is quite well known because he ultimately receives the Medal of Honor for his actions during the Civil War, but he was also incarcerated in Andersonville. But what's particularly interesting about it is his relationship with these 3 men who, as you can see, did not survive Andersonville. Because Michael carried out of Andersonville prison the last will and testament of Peter Toner here and of John Burke, whose actual name was Andrew McKevitt. You have a lot of men who served under an alias, under a different name, for a variety of reasons. Peter Toner was from Letterkenny in County Donegal, but he didn't serve in the 13th Pennsylvania Cavalry. He served in the 90th Pennsylvania Infantry, but him and Michael were both from the same county. And so Peter gave him and Andrew McKevitt, John Burke, who was also in the 90th Pennsylvania Infantry, his last will and testament to take home to his family. Another man who bore witness to that was a guy who's listed as Fanigal here, Farrigal on his pension certificate, almost certainly Fergal Gallagher, who was also from County Donegal, another 13th Pennsylvania cavalryman who we know was a native Irish speaker because of his pension file, and that's why his name is so corrupted, because they still used his Gaelic Irish name, was also involved in this. And so Peter Toner explicitly mentions John Burke, Andrew McKevitt in his will, and then Andrew McKevitt himself subsequently dies and also then leaves a will. And Michael Doherty brings them both back and they're both reported on. So very interesting dynamic where you effectively have Donegal men who are all living in Philadelphia, who are banding together and helping each other in Andersonville. And Doherty is the man who comes out and the others don't and are interred together in Andersonville. So really interesting about the dynamics of how they lived together and died together. Sometimes we get the letters. And if you look at this letter, you will see where it is written from. It says Camp Sumter, Andersonville, Georgia. And prisoners could send letters. It was difficult, but they could send letters out of Andersonville, Georgia. And this was written by a man from Bray in County Wicklow called Joseph Keegan, who had married his wife Mary in Bray in 1848. He had then been a mason by trade. And shortly, you see this all the time, they were in their early 20s. Shortly after their first child is born, they emigrate in 1850. So we know the boat they travel on. We know when they land in July 1850 in Philadelphia. We know their subsequent story as further children. Matthew was born in 1851. Francis is born in 1856. And like a lot of men who apparently have a good job, he was a mason, we see the recessions that are impacting a lot of the North in the early years of the war. He can only get work as a laborer, Joseph. And in late 1863, he seems to enlist for financial reasons. And joins the 183rd Pennsylvania Infantry. And after in and around 4 days of active service, he's captured during the Overland Campaign. And this is him saying that things look okay. We don't know what date it is, sometime in the summer of 1864. Things are looking good. He's just arrived at Andersonville, hoping to get exchange soon. Always rumors of exchanges happening. Didn't occur. He survives Andersonville, but a lot of the prisoners begin to get taken out of Andersonville from September onwards as Sherman is moving in on Atlanta. And a lot of them are moved, a lot of them to a place called Florence. And he dies. He is sick when he leaves Andersonville from what he's endured there. He dies shortly after he arrives in Florence and never makes it home. So this is the last letter his wife ever received from him, this Wicklow immigrant. Just to give you an idea of what they can tell us about immigrant life. And also it's worth noting that there are names here that you might think these guys can't be Irish. But what you get a lot is a lot of these men are not literate. And a lot of the people who are writing down and recording their names don't necessarily know what Irish names sound like or how you spell them. So probably Thomas Millen, Frank Crowe, they're names that if you put an E on the Crow, it's a classic Irish Munster name. But in any event, these are Irish men. Thomas Millen is from Ballywilliam in County Tipperary and served in the 12th New York Cavalry. But we can get glimpses into their immigrant experience and why they emigrate. His family came to America because his parents, who'd been married in 1840 in Ireland, his father dies at the height of the Great Famine in 1847, Black 47. And his family immigrate after that. And that's why he's in the United States. That's why he's there. And that's why he ultimately is interred at Andersonville National Cemetery. Frank Crowe was from Doon in East County Limerick, and he served in a New York unit. And his family story is particularly heartbreaking, given that they all emigrated bar one brother who, because he was crippled, couldn't go with them. And so what the family did was they moved to New York and they used to send money back to pay for his board in Ireland because he couldn't make the journey. And Frank was one of the people who contributed towards this. And so that was one of the things that his money was doing. And he then dies in Andersonville. Peter Corrigan is the man on the right who serves under an alias, Peter Gallagher, so he's buried under his alias. He was from Drumgoon in County Cavan. And here we have what he did for his mother, Alice. It said here after he died that he supported her for at least 10 years prior to entering US service. When he was in Ireland, he weaved in cloth making, earning on average 10 shillings per week in English money, and he paid his mother's rent and purchased her provisions. When he came to the United States prior to entering the army, he sent her £26 on one occasion, £8 on another, and then when he enlisted, he sent a draft amounting to a sum of $400, his enlistment bounty to his mother. And it's almost certainly that money that paid for his mother's emigration to the United States. But he had died he had died as a result of his service, and so probably never met her when she arrived. And on that note, the impact on family is something that comes to the fore with a lot of these men. James Smith at the top here was from a Presbyterian family. His parents were married in Ballyborough in County Cavan before their emigration, and James was born in the United States. But when he died, his father had predeceased him. He was the main breadwinner, and it left his mother to tend to the several small children, underage children she had on her own, and left her in fairly destitute circumstances. On the right is an application for reimbursement for a funeral of a woman in 1878, Bridget Hughes, in Troy, New York. And her husband, John, is reputed to have died in early September in 1864 at Andersonville. The guy applying for her burial has buried her out of the county poorhouse in Troy. And it says that her possessions at the time in 1878, some 14 years after her husband dies, are, quote, a lot of old clothing torn and tattered, and not even the sum of $1. So we can see where she ends up after her husband's death. James McMahon on the bottom left you see here was in the 73rd Pennsylvania Infantry. He died in 16th of May 1864. It left his widow Annie with 6 young children to fend for herself, and Annie turned to drink. In 1868, her aunt wrote that Anne has become a perfectly abandoned character and is drunk whenever she can get a cent to buy liquor with. She does not support any one of the children, but has pawned everything she could to get hold of money. And the deponent fears she has passed any reformation. If she draws her pension, her Civil War pension, her aunt feared that she would spend the whole of it in drink, and none of it would be devoted either to the children or to buy any requisite comfort for herself. So we can imagine the impact that her husband's death has had on her here. And also, thankfully, in this case, she manages to turn her life around. And in 1869, her aunt gives another affidavit where she says she has reformed and is going to be a better woman and will be taking proper care of her children. So when her children were at risk, when her pension was at risk, she managed to turn things around. But you see here the impact that Andersonville is having on these men. And I'm going to wrap up in a minute. But Andersonville, I think it's important to note, didn't just impact Irish Americans who had left Ireland. Each one of the men you see here left a pensioner. These are in our first 350, left a pensioner in Ireland. Owen Harrington, the top left, 30th in Indiana. His mother claimed an American pension in Rosscarbery in County Cork. Michael Kenny's mother claimed one in Galway City. Michael Sullivan's mother was claiming it in Faha in Adrigole and the Beara Peninsula in West Cork. Hugh Coyle's parents, who were reliant on him, were in Muina on the Fanet Peninsula in County Donegal, claiming a pension because of what Andersonville had done. Bernard Logan there is actually Bernard Grogan. His widow was still in Mahara in County Derry when he died in Andersonville. And unknown but buried in Andersonville is Thomas Callaghan, who USS Housatonic, a sailor, Thomas McCarthy, whose wife was in Ballyfeard near Kinsale in County Cork. All of these people left huge loss behind them on the island of Ireland. And sometimes we can trace these people back. This is the house in this stunning location on Arranmore Island off the coast of Donegal, where Paddy Jean Gallagher, who had served in the 38th Illinois Infantry and had been captured at the Battle of Chickamauga, who survived Andersonville. He returned there in the end of the 19th century, and he died in this house in 1920 and is buried in the local cemetery, having never recovered physically from what Andersonville did to him. His pension file is a litany of ailments as a result of it. So Paddy came home occasionally, and this is Glenlark in County Tyrone, very occasionally. We can tell where some of these men were born. If you can see the small house beside the tree here, this ruined house in Glenlark in Tyrone, that is the house of the Ballantynes. That is the house they lived in before they emigrated to the United States. And one of the men almost certainly born in that house was Robert Ballantyne. And unlike Paddy, he did not come home. And that's his grave at Andersonville National Cemetery. So I'll leave it at that. I just think, again, it's worth reiterating the incredible assistance that the project is getting from the Consulate in Atlanta, from the Department of Foreign Affairs. None of it would be happening without Professor Nicholas Allen, who has been a driving force, a tour de force in driving everything on. But it's fantastic that all this support is happening. And I hope you've enjoyed the whirlwind tour of what we're getting up to so far in the early stages. Thanks.
Damian, thank you so much. That was stunning. The visuals at the end as well were amazing, but just the way you've been able to trace their stories is amazing, like breathtaking. I have to say, I'm kind of stunned after hearing them, and I could listen to you talking about it for a lot longer, but we're going to open up for some questions. I know that people might pop questions in the chat. If anyone wants to come in, we've got an open Zoom session for that reason, to kind of keep it interactive. I might kick off with a question to get the ball rolling. I know my colleague Sarah Keane at the Consulate has some questions for you, but my first question is around the documentation and the primary sources that you've used. You mentioned the pension records. How did you gather all of that? You've been able to piece together people's lives in such detail, and how did you go about that?
Yeah, so I mean, it is it's the great boon that comes out of great loss of the Civil War are the pension files, and it is the case that it actually dying in the American Civil War caused an awful lot more of these people's lives to be preserved than if you survived it, and through to be honest, it's through the magnificent work of the National Archives in Washington, D.C. They ran a project where they have scanned, digitized a significant proportion, still only a tiny number of the total. There are millions of pension files from the Civil War, but numerically, in numerical order, we're scanning a number of these files, and so you can access them through a site called Fold3 currently. And so a lot of that information comes from there, but then you can piece other things together. So for example, you know, a lot of the guys, the brothers and everything, that becomes apparent when you're looking at regimental muster rolls and their nativity, and then the links where you see, oh, there are two men with the same name who have died in the same location, and then start digging census information, finding people on the 1860 census. So for example, I found a man only just this morning on the American 1860 census, and lo and behold, this has never happened before. In fact, it said that he was born in Antrim on the 1860 census, which is really rare for them to actually locate where in Ireland they were from on the census. So all that sort of information comes together, and things like newspapers. So all the information on those wills, for example, earlier in it, that all comes from newspaper information, where they're actually reproducing the wills and everything afterwards, because Andersonville captured the attention of the public, particularly in the northern states after the war. So, but the pension files, and I would consistently argue this, I think they're the best source of the lives of 19th century Irish people that exists anywhere in the world, like including Ireland. That they're an amazing, because of the sheer degree, particularly on women's lives, and the degree of information that they're providing is awesome. So yeah.
Thanks. I might let Sarah jump in now, if I know she had a question.
Hi, Damian. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah. I work at the Consulate with Ciara, so I'm taking advantage of my position to skip the queue and ask a question. When you talked about the relationships between the Irish soldiers in Andersonville, I mean, you mostly refer to Irish being infantry members, you know, campaign volunteers. Were there any Irish who held leadership positions within the sort of formal structures, and were there any sort of formal or informal organizational structures in the Irish who were imprisoned in Andersonville. And my second question, and somebody else has already jumped in with the question in the chat as well, is the people that enlisted under aliases. I mean, you mentioned that, and it's fascinating. And the fact that you're uncovering an alias to get a real name is incredible. So if you could speak to that as well, that'd be great.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. I probably should have said at the outset, so the first thing is that Andersonville is a prison for enlisted men. So the officers, there are a couple of officers who are imprisoned in Andersonville and stay there, but by and large, they're sent elsewhere. So all of it's a prison for ordinary soldiers. And what's interesting about the dynamics of how men move together, so they would come in there often with men from their own regiment. So sometimes that would be an ethnic Irish unit, but often it wasn't. And so it's those there's like a web of interactions that you have to think of. They don't have a single web of they're not just interacting with Irish people, but they would be interacting with their own units. In Andersonville, men were assigned to what they called messes, where everybody was supposed to go and get their food proportioned together, although they don't appear to have necessarily always lived in those units, but they had to go and get their rations in that order. And so trying to unpick that, but hierarchies did develop in the camp, and it's one of the areas we'll be touching on is the kind of the unsavory aspect of Andersonville is the Andersonville Raiders, who are a notorious group in the prison of prisoners, and they have a strong Irish-American flavor to them, who appear to, at least they were accused consistently of robbing other prisoners. And in the end get summary justice. They're put on trial by their fellow prisoners. A number of them are executed. And so there are a couple of Andersonville Raiders on our list as well. And there's been some very interesting work being done on them. But again, there's all the dynamics that we're trying to tease out about all this, about how much prejudice is playing into this among other units as well. So there's a really interesting dynamic, and that's really one of the big things I'm hoping that we'll get out of the project. But it's at its very infancy now. In terms of aliases, it's one of the most interesting things, because you would never imagine that the aliases could be recoverable. But that's where the pension files really come into their own, because you can imagine if your husband has died in the war and he called himself Tom Smith, but his name was actually John Clark, you have got to prove that he's one and the same person and why they call themselves that. And the number one thing that you always think of is that they have done it because there's something untoward going on. Like, that's kind of what immediately springs to your mind. But in fact, that's often not the case. A lot of early Irish volunteers seem to do it because they have, I think, some almost innate distrust of authority, that they think if they go in under another name that they have their options are open, that they can leave. You have men who I have seen go in under enlistments because their father is an abusive alcoholic and they don't want to bear his surname going into the military. You have people who are doing it for a variety of reasons, because if they're underage, they don't want their parents to know about it. Sometimes where men were duped into serving in certain instances as substitutes, they were put in under another name by the man who was doing it to them. And so you have a whole network. It's interesting that there does appear to actually be almost a rule. By far, the most common thing that they did when they were trying to take alias was use their mother's maiden name. It's I'd say in about 50% of the cases, that's actually the case. I actually did come across, he didn't die at Andersonville, but another man in an alias, enlisted under an alias because he had been working in a shop with English and native-born non-Irish Americans, and his name was Patrick, and he enlisted under an alias because he didn't want to be called Paddy anymore, because he was sick of being called Paddy. And he actually died at the first Battle of the War, first Bull Run. See, there's this whole swathe of reasons, but what you see quite often, and they're nearly always buried under their aliases then when they die at Anderson. So it's a fascinating subject.
Thanks, Damian. I have to say, as an Irish mother myself, I'm enjoying their allegiance to their mothers from a lot of lot of the men that you've uncovered. There's a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm just going to read them out to you, and you can take them all together, and then I'll give anyone a chance if they want to, turn their video on, turn their mic on, even, and ask you directly. But just bear with me for 1 second. I'll let you know what is in the chat. Leo asked you how you identified the unknown soldier. Brian asked about the aliases question. I think you've answered that. Lots of comments on how amazing the map is. And then an interesting question from Michael, who says that it's interesting that large numbers of Irish enlisted in certain non-ethnic regiments. Did they enlist as community groups? He's thinking of comparisons with PALs, with similar in the First World War. And would enlisting in groups like that have helped them survive? Then we have a great comment from Jackie on how to access the digital pensions. And then Patrick just says that Michael Sullivan from FAHA got his interest, and that, Dennis Murphy from the adjacent townland was killed at Second Bull Run, and they must have known each other. So like lots of the names are prompting lots of interest. But if you want to take those few questions, and then we'll throw open the floor again, and then we'll wrap up if there's nothing else coming in. Thanks.
No problem. For Leo's question, hey Leo, hope all's good. In terms of the unknown one, so that came out of actually another project I was doing where I was looking to identify pensions that were being claimed in the island of Ireland. So I came across that because when I was doing that work, I came across his pension, the pension file associated with him, and it said he died at Andersonville. So there's an interesting element, and it'll be something that I'm hoping to tease out. I'm going to be doing some research at Andersonville itself, but there are a number of people who it's claimed have died there or reported to have died there who aren't necessarily named in the cemetery. But all the information suggests that they did die there and are interned there, but they're one of these people who are among the unknown. So that's how he was identified as the US Navy guy, because there's through the Widow's Naval File. In relation to the guys who are serving in non-ethnic units, it really is a variance. So you can have from one man serving. So there's a guy, anybody who's ever seen, there's a very famous movie called Gettysburg. People may or may not have seen it. It's a hugely popular film. And there's an Irish character in that, in a unit called the 20th Maine. He's a fictional character. But I actually did find a guy who was the same age as him who served in that unit, a guy called Tommy Welsh in the 20th Maine. And Tommy Welsh dies at Andersonville prison. He's taken prisoner, but he was called the old man of the regiment because he was in his 30s. But Tommy that wasn't a heavily Irish regiment. He was mainly serving with other people who weren't from Ireland. But so you get from him all the way through, but you encounter Irish guys. There's an Irish lad I know who was born in New York, who wrote home saying that he was disappointed that he enlisted when he was away for work in Massachusetts because the regiment he selected has no Irish lads in it. And of course, this guy had never been in Ireland, but he had an affinity for other ethnic Irish that he wanted to be in a unit with them. So it certainly helped if they were there with other Irish guys. So if you have a handful of 5 or 6 or 10 men, they did tend to tent together. They did tend to do things like write each other's letters. And many of these bigger units also had maybe a company that was ethnically Irish, maybe 60 men or so who had enlisted as an Irish company. So you get this full gambit, but it's a sweeping range across. That's the key thing. That's why we see so many different units. But you're interested as well about the parishes and the other man killed at Second Bull Run. And this is it. If you pieced it all together from across the Civil War, you would have this patterning across all of Ireland of men who lost their lives from these areas. It would be immense.
Thanks, Damian. And that's why the project is going to continue. And this is really a long-term partnership, hopefully. And I think just seeing the chats and messages people are sending, everyone is blown away by your presentation and hugely appreciative of all of the time and the work you've put in.